All right, Soren, let's move on to our next session. We have Andy Babin coming up, and I want to make sure I get this session title correct. IP forwarding and DHCP, two simple things that to make your show network better. I think Andy's going to take us to school. What do you think?
I'm sure he is. Andy's always over my head. He's a friend I haven't seen in many years. I'm looking forward to this.
Let's bring him in. Hey,
Hello,
Andy.
hello. Hey, I
Hey,
realized
Andy
this on the
Babin.
way in this morning. You guys gave me my first gig, the two of you. So it's kind of a weird moment right now.
Look
Like,
at
so I thought about that this morning. I'm like, wait a minute, Soren and Laura were the original Nike thing I did. So,
Well, our deepest apologies.
oh yeah,
or
you started me down this rabbit hole.
thank you for
You're all
hanging
to
in.
blame.
Yeah, or you're
Yes,
welcome, or something like that.
Something like that, really.
Nice to see you,
all
Andy.
right, Andy.
Likewise.
Over to you.
Okay, so as Laura and Soren said, my name is Andy Babin. My primary work of recently has kind of been a systems engineer for live events when live events happened. And over the past few years, my specialty within that has kind of turned into the network as a whole, as everything's evolved into becoming more and more IP based, whether that's video, audio, lighting, content, anything. So I've kind of made a little niche for myself managing the network as its own entity. And there's two really simple things that I feel are very overlooked that I tend to use a lot on my networks and my designs that most people overlook and I feel make life way better. And those are, as kind of the title of my presentation suggested, DHCP and IP forwarding. So we're going to talk about some of those today. But before we get into that, I want to make a couple of assumptions about our show network. Here is a network switch, how I kind of lay it out normally per show. This could be in a server rack or a front of house rack or really anywhere. For the sake of our presentation today, we have 4 VLANs. We have a general VLAN, an ArtNet VLAN, an MANet VLAN, and a D3Net VLAN, which are segregated networks on the switch, as well as a management trunk VLAN. If you look at all these VLANs, they are all tagged as VLANs are, but each one of them's third octet in its IP address corresponds to the VLAN tag. That's actually the first lesson of my show network, which I feel a lot of people don't do, because it quickly allows you to correspond your VLAN tag with an IP address. And that's just 10 is 10, 20 is 20, et cetera, et cetera. I normally go 192.168. ArtNet's obviously its own special beast because 10 dot, because ArtNet's weird, which we'll get into that too. But as a general rule, I try to keep my third octet, whatever my VLAN tag is, as just a basic organization. Also on my shows and in our little assumptions here, there's some form of router. This could be basically any type of router box. I've been using pfSense lately as my software package of choice, running on just an x86 basic Intel NUC or server or something. There's also other solutions out there. The Edge router is another one I like to use a lot because it's cheap, pretty widely available, and is very feature packed for its price point. There's also some big iron things, Cisco, Meraki, Fortinet, Vios, big iron enterprise stuff, which we're really not going to get into. Honestly, I like pfSense because it's free, it's open source, it's based on BSD, so any Unix knowledge applies to it. Ditto with the Edge routers. They're based on Linux. They're relatively cheap and they're pretty feature packed. They're also widely community supported in the sense of if you Google basically anything, you'll find an answer for it. So I like having that level of support. The router in this conversation is connected to each VLAN, whether that's a physical cable per VLAN or a trunk port, doesn't really matter. As I said, everything that I'm talking about today can be easily Googled, which I also like because Google is your friend. Here's an IP sheet from a typical show. This is only probably a quarter of it. But IP addresses are the bane of my existence because every device has one and every device may even have more than one. And conflicting IP addresses or incorrectly configured IP addresses can bring a show down to its knees. If devices can't talk on the network, the show doesn't happen. And generally speaking on show networks, I find a lot of people stick to manually configuring IPs, which I don't necessarily think is the best way to do it. It's the famous, we've done it this way for years, but I don't necessarily think that's the way we do it. And I've been trying to actually get away from that by using DHCP. What is DHCP? DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. Basically, it's a protocol that hands out IP addresses to devices that ask for them. It's super simple. It's one of the earliest internet protocols to exist. And basically every device in the world has used it in some form or another. Your laptop's probably using it to connect to the internet right now. But it's something we often tend to ignore on ship site, which perplexes me, hence this talk. I try to put a DHCP server on every VLAN, and the DHCP server will run within the router. Here's a screenshot of pfSense's DHCP server config. And as you can see here, I have my range set on that server to hand out my IP addresses between 201 and 250. I generally do just what I call the random IP addresses high in that 200 to 250 range to keep them out of the way to a certain extent, if you want to think of it that way. But as you can see here, I have them handing out the VLAN ID as well in that 10 dot range because this is on the general VLAN. So I like this because if you're also, it aids in troubleshooting because if you plug in any device to any port on the network, you'll get an IP address and that IP address tells you what VLAN that port is on. You don't have to worry about going into the switch config or opening the web GUI or logging in or remembering the IP of the switch or any of that stuff. You just plug in a port and say, oh, the third number is 10, that's on management. Oh, the third number is 60, that's on D3. Oh, the third number is 40, it's on MANet. Or whatever tags you choose to use. Those are just kind of the ones that are ingrained in my memory. Also in that, having DHCP enabled, if you plug something into a port on the switch and it's a known good port, like say it is the management port and you have a producer show up with a laptop wanting to load files onto the server, you know that if they plug in, their IP address works. It works. It's magic. It works. You don't have to go in to right click into Windows, hope they have admin permission, hope they remember their password, or even if you have gear yourself. I've had servers come to me that are like, oh, they're by default DHCP. Oh, they're just working. Cool. So it makes the troubleshooting process easier. It makes everything easier, and especially when you're in a crunch, you don't want to think about, oh, well, I think 192.168.10. I think 43 is open. Try that. See what happens. It eliminates troubleshooting, and it makes life better. The other fun thing I like to do, which I think that's in the next slide, is you can do a DNS suffix within the DHCP scope as well, and that'll even tell you within Windows, and I think Mac does it too. I'm mostly Windows at this point. You can even name your VLANs basically. So as you can see in this slide, if I do IP config, it shows, oh yeah, that's on D3net, as well as looking at the .60 to see, oh yeah, it's on D3net. Just super simple ways to troubleshoot quickly without even thinking about it. And as you can see on this slide, that's in the domain name field on pfSense. It's in there on the Edge router too. Most of these screens look relatively similar between product lines. Excuse me. The other thing in this page, which we're going to get into here in a second, is the default gateway, which currently is the IP of the router. It's another just example that's the general VLAN with those settings applied. The one common thing that everyone tells me when I tell them I use DHCP on my networks is, first off, I'm nuts, which is untrue. I mean, it might be true, but the big rebuttal I get is that DHCP will hand out an IP address that already is handed out, and that is flat out not true. And that seems to be like the biggest misconception among this protocol is DHCP will actively check for an IP address before handing it out. So if that IP is in use and it tries to hand it out, it just won't do it. It will hand out a different safe IP. So it literally will foolproof your network into working. Versus static IPs will conflict. Windows may or may not pop up an error. OS X may or may not pop up an error. Your Blackmagic router definitely won't pop up an error. Versus DHCP, it just works and everything coexists happily. So I really like doing it. If you are a stickler for things and things being nicely organized, most DHCP servers do allow you to do some of them refer to it as a reservation, some of them refer to it as a lease, some of it refer to it as a static lease, where you can actually go in and say, give this device a static IP address. So no matter when it plugs in the network, it will always get an IP address that's the same. It will always get .30 or .31 or .59 or whatever you tell it to be. So you could go in and actually do your servers that way, or do any other show critical devices that are, specifically being targeted per IP address that way. you can even take this a step further from a gear and logistics standpoint, that if everything's DHCP, everything always works. You don't have to worry about gear coming back from the shop with the wrong IP set on the desk or any of that stuff. If it's all DHCP, it just works. And if it doesn't, it falls back into the safe 169 range. But that seems to always be like kind of the rebuttal I get from people when I talk about DHCP. The other big rebuttal I get with DHCP is that redundancies and all that within our show networks. And it is possible to do a redundant DHCP server. pfSense is generally the one I use, makes it pretty easy. You literally just enter in the second IP of it in the first one and they synchronize each other. It's pretty darn easy. And obviously you can take this as far or as near as you want to go with this concept, but I've tried to take it pretty far and I've had great success with it. And even just, it's worth it for the troubleshooting alone, let alone every other benefit it gives you. The other big thing in my making show networks easy is I feel everyone who's ever worked in content or servers has had their network screen look like this, where you have 28 billion network adapters. You have ArtNet, you have MANet, you have content network, you have D3 network, you have automation data, you have everything and then some coming in. And it's just a mess. And back to the IP address conversation, you're having 28 different IP addresses to juggle that may or may not overlap each other, that may or may not conflict with each other. And if you have two USB adapters that are the same IP, they break and it just gets messy. And I've also seen people do this with trunked VLANs and it's just messy and I don't like it and it bothers me. It does not bring me joy. One of the ways to really eliminate this is to use what's called IP forwarding. IP forwarding at its simplest way is basically the router or the switch will take packets on one subnet and forward them to another based on the gateway. In our environment that we're talking about here, it's literally just called IP forwarding. There's also other protocols. Cisco refers to it as router on a stick, I think sometimes. There's also EBGP and OSPF that, hold on a second, I'm getting dark. OSPF that make the internet work with routing and IP forwarding, but we're not getting into that today. Basically, what this does is each device on the network has that default gateway, which is assigned by DHCP if you would like it to be, which is generally the IP of your router on that subnet. So looking at this, it's 192.168.10.1. I normally keep them low. But as you can see, I'm pinging 192.168.60.202, and it's working. What happens in this under the hood is the ping command actually says, okay, that's not on my subnet. So it goes and it talks to the default gateway and says, hey, do you have this? And it goes, why, yes, I do. And it makes that handshake happen. It's super simple. It's super quick. And by default, it's unicast really traffic only, which is kind of the downside of it. You can also get into multicast with it. But like, for example, on smaller shows, I'll keep my media server separate from my lighting consoles and my lighting network and do unicast streaming ACN to them. So I don't have to worry about having a second LAN on my D3s or vice versa on my lighting console. It just works. Kind of the same boat as DHCP of it just works. On some devices like pfSense, for example, you actually have to go in and specify what you want to be allowed. So like this is my rules page for my general VLAN. So I'm saying allow D3net and allow MANet to talk. However, some devices by default allow everything. Some devices by default block everything. It just kind of is a manufacturer vendor dependence on this. So you just gotta make sure rules are in place. The other thing with this is you can explicitly deny things. So like if, for example, if you don't want your D3net to get out to the internet, you can block that. Or if you don't want your D3net to be able to talk to your content net, or if you don't want your lighting consoles to be able to talk to automation for some reason, you can explicitly block that in this, which is nice. And this is just a, where's that the right screenshot? There we go. So as you can see here, this is actually behind under the hood running the traceroute command. And what that does is I'm trying, you can't see me pointing. I'm trying to see the path to that IP and it's showing, but it is going through that default gateway as its first step. And from there, it's going to its end goal. What are the downsides to this? Well, as I said, it's limited to unicast only in the simple config. You can get into multicast, but that's way beyond the scope of this conversation and this presentation. You're limited by the uplink and the speed of your router. So if you're doing something like Telnet or ArtNet or automation data, you're fine letting the router handle this. It's small amounts of traffic. I wouldn't necessarily use this to transfer content for the show though. Like, so for example, if you're just doing gigabit network to your router, you're limited to a gig speed. If you're doing 10G, 10, etc. This could also be avoided by doing it in the switch natively, but again, beyond the scope of this, trying to keep it simple. You're also, as I kind of said, you have some security concerns. Security concerns within a show network are something we really don't talk about that much, actually, and I feel really need to be addressed in another talk for another day. But are your servers allowed to hit the internet? Is your content machines allowed to see your automation network? Is your, any of those various scenarios? And yeah, by default, a lot of the devices are allow all. So you want to just make sure you lock down appropriately and all that. Also, like the DHCP, there is a single point of failure if you configure it properly or improperly. There are ways to mitigate this. Again, pfSense does have various redundancies where you can have 2 boxes online and one will automatically fail over. Most of the other vendors also have similar protocols and setups for that. But it is a single point of failure and it is a single point of bottleneck. So that is something to be aware of. But yeah, that's basically here's some links. These are the software packages I like. As I said before, I like pfSense. It's free, it's open source. I play with it in VMware a lot. I actually did everything in this presentation on 3 virtual machines. So it's nice to be able to prototype and break things from the comfort of your laptop. Vios is kind of the next move up. It's more enterprisey. pfSense has a pretty web GUI and wizards for everything. Vios is a raw command line that says good luck. Then on the hardware side, I like the Ubiquiti network stuff. The edge routers range from a $40 box to a $4,000 box. Pick your poison there. But they have a very nice web GUI, widely supported, widely community, driven, all that fun stuff. Then you also have Fortinet, who kind of seems to be one of the leaders right now in the more larger enterprise grade stuff, but they all kind of do the same thing, just in different ways. So yeah, those are 2 simple ways to make your network better. Any questions?
That's great, Andy. Thank you so much. Your links, I think maybe when we wrap up here, we should post them either in Discord chat or Hopin chat or both. So that people can actually get access to them. Also, when later this week, I will post all these videos on the Framework website and distribute those links to attendees so that you can come back and review slides in more detail, collect these links, or any other specifics you want to know about Andy's presentation. That's a lot of information, Andy.
That was a lot.
I know.
But I gather I gather your approach is controversial. Yeah, not everybody shares your point of view.
Yeah, it's a small world. So I don't necessarily. Generally, I am the person doing it. So I've shared my views with some people, and I've had some people say, "Yeah, this is great. Why aren't we doing this more?" And I've had other people go, "You're nuts." And I think that like everything in our industry, as the world evolves, and oh, well, we've always done it that way. Well, why? And I'm in the well, why point on the networks. And even, 5 years ago, we were fighting to have, VLANs on networks where it was, prior to that, it was 4 different switches in the rack and 4 different strands of fiber between 4 different racks. And now that's an accepted thing. 4 years ago, people were telling me I was nuts. So, it's just the evolution of the technology.
Yeah. And even with what I consider a lot of density of detail, there were several points in the presentation that seemed like you could go even further down those rabbit holes on different threads. Is there anything you're particularly interested in highlighting for attendees?
The routing protocols has been a kind of a rabbit hole I've been going down, especially as we are a more converged world, and the video over IP has become a huge thing with that, where not only are you managing the flow of traffic, but you're also, coordinating the traffic, because you are hitting into the limitations of the hardware, whether that's the physical link speed or the amount of traffic being passed or the amount of traffic the end device can handle. That's starting to become more and more of a thing where we're segregating these networks and very explicitly routing what we want, almost in the video sense of the word. It is video data generally, but it is in the video sense of the word, where, yeah, we need source A to go to destination 1, 2, and 7, but not 5. And that's simply due to hardware limitations on both ends.
I think we have some attendee questions coming in. Let's start with
Here's
a
one
question
from
from Rod. I'll let you take it, Soren.
Rod asks, are you using name resolution for accessing specific machines for specific tasks? Or is it that you don't necessarily know the IP address of any given device?
I have been implementing name resolution in DNS, which is another protocol for basically how when you type in google.com, it knows to go to Google, and it knows that IP address. I have been implementing that on some of the shows, not as much, simply because by the time we're ready to implement that, the world's on fire anyway. It's something my like to do next time list is always high on my to do next time list. And it's something I find myself implementing privately, but not necessarily distributing to the show team as well.
I have a question about security, Andy. You mentioned it as something that needs more attention, and I find in my work it's a topic that comes up more and more often with higher and higher barriers. So I'd just love to hear from you on security and concerns that you have, or solutions that you have, or what you see coming down the pike as common practice for us.
I mean, it's a very broad topic, unfortunately. And on the show network point of view, I mean, yeah, we have sensitive data on our networks, whether that's the content for the pre-release song that doesn't exist yet because the artist is premiering it on that award show, or whether that's, I've gotten many production managers who have the passport scans of the entire crew on their laptop and are sitting on the public Wi-Fi. Like, I think security in our industry from a cybersecurity standpoint is very lacking. And I know on the higher up producer side of things, they're generally a lot more attentive to it. I'm getting watermarked scripts and watermarked dailies of, the film I'm working on to have my name on them. But then on the flip side of that, the boots on the ground have, the entire album sitting on their desktop of the artist that hasn't been released yet. And ditto with like the media servers and the lighting consoles. All those names are there. All that data is there. And sometimes that data is on the those servers, and that data is on the public internet. And it's something that I feel that our industry really hasn't addressed at the lower levels. Obviously, the producers are well aware of it and the consequences of that data getting out. But the lighting programmer who's carrying around a thumb drive with, raw multi-tracks of the pop star's album really isn't thinking about necessarily.
Right.
And that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother conversation.
I think we could give you a whole day, Andy. We have a question coming in from Oranos. Is there a lot of progress happening in network speed and hardware? What are the next steps in the evolution of networks?
I mean, the next steps in evolution of networks, honestly, are being driven by the video over IP and the content side of things. I mean, D3 Disguise is pushing the 25G pretty hard with the render stream, and that the 2500G technology is hitting the price point where it is feasible for us to put in our shows. And we have been deploying shows with 2500G networks as either the core or the content or both. I mean, even within the past year or two, the 10G network has hit the point where it's reasonably priced for your average show. That used to be kind of a luxury item on the bigger shows. And I mean, the cost is coming down and the speed is going up. And as screen resolution gets bigger and as audio hits higher bit rate and as everyone's streaming everything and as there's more video going across the network, those speeds have to increase. And honestly, I think the next step is just bandwidth and the price to get that bandwidth coming down to a more affordable level, which will, speed up the adoption of it. I have gigabit fiber to my home, which, 3 years ago was a pipe dream, but, technology improves, technology comes down in price, and hopefully we'll see 2500G networks on show site very soon as a mainstay.
And that seems to be a critical piece, getting more people to have those connections to their home, as so many are still working from home. Like even to present an event like this, where we're dependent on, international points of internet at varying speeds. And this is critical for us being able to deliver this content and join together. And yet, our backup plan is still a cell phone.
Well, and raw speed, but also too, and as the events go virtual, having the conversations with the producers of, okay, yeah, the venue has gigabit internet coming in, but is that residential internet? Is that small business internet? Or is that multi-homed fiber, with proper peering? there's, various tiers of that 1 gig speed or that 500 meg speed, and that's the other big thing is, oh yeah, gigabit, internet at home. It's like, that doesn't mean anything if the other end is crap.
Excellent. Well, this has been great having you, Andy. I think that's it for our attendee questions at this point. So we'll take a minute for some Framework Festival notes and say thank you.
Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much. It's great to see you.
Likewise.